Welcome back, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Okay, perfect. I hope everyone had a great lunch and had a chance to go check out the kiosks in the library room. I'm really excited for our next panel. I feel like everyone's disappeared in the room when I started to talk. As a product owner at the Canada School of Public Service, the topic of our next panel, inclusive design, is something that I'm really excited about. In previous roles that I've worked in, I've never really thought much about inclusive design. And now, actually having the opportunity to design products, I can see how important it is. So inclusive design is about delivering an outstanding user experience. Every design decision we make has the potential to include or exclude the people that we serve. I think understanding diversity is becoming increasingly important, and we heard some of that importance from the panels this morning, and particularly in a digital age. So coming up, we have some top experts in the government, academia, and the private sector that are here to tell us all about inclusive design and why it's important in all the work that we do. But before we begin, we are going to watch a video.
Innovation, I think, actually happens on the day-to-day basis, and that's where it matters. I don't think you always have to disrupt fundamentally. I think there's lots that you can do within the current processes and structures. However, there is a time for when that big fundamental change is needed.
L'innovation, c'est tout simplement faire les choses mieux avec ce que l'on a finalement. Tout simplement chercher à rendre les choses plus simples, moins complexes, quelque chose qui rejoint les personnes facilement. Si on perturbe simplement pour perturber, ça va rendre les gens autour de nous simplement un peu plus, je dirais, fermes et ils vont pas avoir nécessairement l'esprit ouvert à ces nouvelles idées que les personnes veulent apporter. Alors, l'idée, c'est de rassembler les personnes autour d'une idée. La perturbation, c'est l'idée. Et le reste, c'est d'amener les personnes vers le changement.
Innovation is viewed as something that's new, but in a sense it's actually not. Innovation has been a continuous evolution of idea generation. Idea generation, whether it's about thinking about things differently, about creating things differently. So even though we're in a world where things are evolving and changing really quickly, innovation has been around for a while. It's interesting, disrupt always has this sort of a negative sound to it, but it's not. I mean, it's really about experimentation. And so if you apply experimentation, it is challenging the status quo. But you got to do it with a little bit of balance. It's not throwing everything into a world of experimentation, but finding where are those opportunities to apply it. It's a fabulous thing. This is what drives us to actually innovate and find new ways of doing things.
Innovation is doing things differently to actually improve the experience for your customers, or doing things differently to improve the experience for you and your coworkers. Innovation is a spectrum. It starts with doing little incremental things differently, to actually doing things in a big way differently, and it's about how you work and actually about what you create. Disruption and innovation go hand in hand, but they're not the same.
It's just finding ways to give people the space and the freedom to do something differently.
A lot of people tend to think that innovation is technology, but innovation can be doing policy a different way. Innovation being an improvement necessitates change, but disruption seems to have a negative connotation. And so I don't think that innovation necessarily has to be disruptive if it can be integrated seamlessly. Change doesn't have to be big or technological. It can be simple and small incremental changes over time as we decide to do things a different way can have a large impact.
A lot smaller, with all these folks. Anyone wants to come a little bit closer, feel free to come at any time, As I mentioned, I'm not a spitter when I talk, so we should be good. Donc, allons-y maintenant avec notre session. Adopter une approche axée sur l'inclusion en matière de conception. Comment obtenir un impact maximal. Cette séance interactive avec des experts du domaine vous présenteront des exemples de conception inclusive et à la façon dont vous pouvez naturellement concevoir pour maximiser l'impact sur de nombreux utilisateurs de tous les horizons. Veuillez vous joindre à moi pour accueillir notre modératrice Kenza Boukara, qui est une directrice et membre du personnel enseignant à l'École de la fonction publique du Canada. Donc, merci beaucoup, Kenza. Ainsi que nos panélistes Denise Garot, Nourhan Hegazi, Colin Clark, and via webcast, who you can see shortly on the screen here, we have Anne-Marie Sebastian, who's coming to us via Skype. Donc, sans plus tarder, je passe la parole à Kenza. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Jean. Good afternoon, everyone. J'espère que vous m'entendez bien, ça va? Alors, bon après-midi. J'espère que vous avez eu un bon lunch. So, it's a pleasure to be here today and to talk about inclusive design mindset with a group of experts. And we have Anne-Marie. Hi. So my name is Kenza Bouchara. I'm a director and a faculty member here within the School of Public Service. My angle in the learning program that I work on is actually unconscious biases, and how by managing our unconscious biases we get into fostering inclusive workplaces and also inclusive products, policy, programs, and initiatives. So I'm glad that in the context of this digital forum we have a session on inclusive, and we don't forget inclusion in the digital world, in innovation, avec la multiplication des technologies de l'information, avec l'intelligence artificielle, la robotisation. Il y a toujours, et très important, matière à parler de l'inclusion et comment adopter une approche inclusive dans tout ce que l'on fait, quel que soit notre domaine dans lequel on travaille, que ce soit les communications, les politiques, les programmes, les finances, l'approvisionnement. So it's a great pleasure to be able to talk about that today. So without further ado, I'm going to leave the floor to the member of the panel to introduce themselves and maybe link like your respective role with the theme of inclusive design and in the context of innovation. Norhan?
Thank you, Kenza. First of all, I wanted to thank you for having me on the panel and for everyone who's here today. So my name is Norhan, and I currently work as an inclusive design lead at the Center for Gender Inclusive Services at Treasury Board Secretariat. I'm also a digital fellow with the Canada School, teaching in the design stream. And I teach a human-centered design course at Carleton, so really in between the world of learning and applying design to better policy and program development. I'm a designer in training, so I started in product design, went more into education and learning, and then did my master's in innovation. And I worked in IRCC for a couple of years, focused on the newcomer client experience before joining TBS. So a lot of my work has focused on understanding how we can build capacity for inclusive service, so really thinking about the process of integrating inclusion and embedding it into culture. And right now the work that I'm doing on my team focuses on introducing a policy direction on how departments collect and display sex and gender information, and supporting departments in better understanding how they can translate that into a gender inclusive service. So really thinking about, how do we go from policy implementation to making sure that clients receive services that meet their needs and make them feel included and heard. So that's me. Thank you.
Great. Good afternoon. I am also really honored to be on this panel. My name is Colin Clark. I'm the Associate Director of the Inclusive Design Research Center at OCAD University, formerly known as Ontario College of Art and Design in Toronto. And over the past almost 25 years, I've had the privilege of helping to grow the field of inclusive design with our director, Jutta Treviranus, who is an early pioneer in inclusive design. And started doing graphic design and web accessibility. I started doing things like audits and evaluations for large companies on how to make accessible websites in the very early days of the web and web accessibility. I taught myself how to write software and to program, and eventually helped to lead our group's work around creating technologies and software architectures that help to support inclusion and greater personalization, and how to build systems that can adopt this one-size-fits-one approach to inclusive design. These days, my work is really largely around finding new design methods and techniques for how to do inclusive design, and in particular working with communities to do co-design, so to design with them rather than for them, and engage communities in the process of doing inclusive design.
Bonjour, hello everybody. Moi c'est Denise Garot, et puis je vous remercie de l'occasion de vous parler et à mes chers collègues aujourd'hui. Disons que j'étais un peu surprise qu'on veuille que je vienne parler sur un panel qui discute de toutes choses digital, puisque ce n'est pas mon expertise, mais j'ai très hâte de voir où sont les synergies. Et déjà, en vous entendant, je vois où ce que ça peut possiblement aller. Donc, je viens de WAGE, Women and Gender Equality Canada, Department for Women and Gender Equality Canada. And I lead a small but mighty team that does GBA Plus, so Gender-Based Analysis Plus, Center for Excellence. And I won't go on about how long I've been working in the bureaucracy, but I will say that increasingly my interests have been in whole of government approaches and policies and strategies. Donc, j'ai travaillé dans le domaine de langue officielle, sur la feuille de route pour les langues officielles. Suite à ça, dans le domaine de l'emploi jeunesse, où il y avait 11 ministères impliqués. Et maintenant, avec l'équipe de la CS+, et encore, ce qui me fait triper, c'est de regarder un enjeu, une question de façon de système. Et voilà, je vois vraiment des belles synergies possibles ici. Donc, merci de l'accueil.
Merci. Anne-Marie, we have Anne-Marie via video conference with us.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So hi, yes, my name is Anne-Marie Sebastian, and it's a pleasure to be part of the panel today. I by no means would call myself an expert in any way when it comes to accessibility and inclusive design, but I've really been drawn to this kind of field and space because of how necessary, and I think I basically work in a space right now where I work with a lot of designers, training them, explaining to them what UX is, and really preparing them for the field. And one thing I always bring up with them is like, you have a lot of power as a UX designer because you're putting things out in the world. You're kind of dictating how people are going to use certain things, interact with different services and products on a daily basis, and how it's really important to maintain that inclusivity. So that's what I currently do today. And I've just been really interested in the space and just making sure that our curriculum and what we teach, even when it comes to training as a UX designer, incorporates that. A little bit about my background. I started as a traditional graphic designer about 8 years ago. I worked in the space primarily more with print design and posters and more agency-like type of work. Eventually, I started working for a Canadian bank, so worked with their team. We really kind of worked in the mobile space within financial technology. And from there, I just started working with different startups and small businesses and sometimes even medium businesses as well to just help them figure out their customer base, their product strategy, and what they're pushing to market. But through that entire process, you know, one thing that really, and when it comes to UX design as well, is really understanding the user, the people that we're designing for, and also seeing that a lot of times in that process, we weren't always looking and being mindful of making our products inclusive. And because, you know, we talk about in the video just a moment ago, like disruption, and how like sometimes that has a connotation of like, we got to move fast and we got to figure things out on the go. And I didn't always see that that was something that we looked for in our process. So it's really just become something in this space that I really think want to advocate for more of. And hopefully on this panel today, we can have a great discussion to kind of build that educational piece and get more people aware of the topic. And that's what brings me here today. So I currently teach UX design, a lead educator for a company in Toronto called BrainStation, where we help people that have been working in any respective industry move into the field of UX and train them for that. On this side, I also run a consulting firm where I work with different businesses and startups to help them bring their products to life. And yeah, I'm just excited to be part of this panel today.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you. So I just want to mention that we're in an interactive session, so we'll be using Kahoot, which is a learning platform. So I invite you to go to kahoot.it. It's kahoot.it. If you want to play, learn and play at the same time. We were supposed to give a prize for those people who actually answers all the questions right, but we were told at the latest minute that we're not supposed to give gift. So I think there is some disruption to do there, some thinking of being more innovative and be able to do that. So I'm just throwing out the idea for people maybe in procurement or dealing with that. So we're going to be starting using Kahoot. They're going to be, once it's effective, you're going to see questions. We may want to go for the first question when it's ready. Is it ready? Thank you. So the first question is, ta-da. So, inclusive designer, design for what? En français, donc bon, je vais le dire en anglais d'abord. So is it for people with disability? Is it for people of different culture? Is it for people who speak different language? Or is it for everyone? Donc, je vais le dire rapidement en français. Le design inclusif est fait pour qui? Les personnes qui ont des incapacités, les personnes qui viennent de cultures différentes, les personnes qui parlent de différentes langues, ou tout le monde. Fait que je vous invite à répondre si ça vous intéresse. C'est intéressant de voir, de jouer en même temps. So once you are actually answering the question and using the application, I would like to start the discussion and actually, what is design? What is inclusive design? I think that we all want to know exactly what we're talking about, having kind of consistent, approach on what it is. And we heard a universal design, we heard inclusive design. So which one should we use? And which one is the most important for our work? Or is it one part of another? And whose responsibility is it to design? It's all about how it works and what it is. So anyone who want to start? Colin?
Sure, I can do my best, but of course it's an inclusive panel, so please interrupt me.
Yeah, good point.
I do apologize that I can't be inclusive of Canada's 2 languages, but I'll speak in English, and if you want to translate as well, that would be great. I mean, for me, inclusive design there could be an easy answer, right? The 49 people who said inclusive design is designing for everyone, designing for human difference in terms of language, cultural background, disability, all kinds of forms of human difference. But a big part of inclusive design for me is how to design with different perspectives at the same time. And we can't ever get out of our own viewpoint and our perspective fully. So what that also means is that inclusive design is finding new ways for people who are different from us as designers to participate in the design process. And that's a major shift in terms of the way a typical design process and the roles and responsibilities within design work. You think, okay, an expert designer, an expert product manager or owner is in charge and makes these decisions. But with inclusive design, we have to start thinking, how can we bring people with lived experience into the process of designing alongside us? What techniques are there to design in a more participatory way? And then how can we bring in the perspectives that are missing? So there's often kind of a practice of saying, well, who's not here? And how can we include them in a new way? So again, designing from multiple perspectives and with people with differences of various kinds and that participation. And then maybe also thinking about not just isolated and individual products, but actually thinking in terms of systems. Shifting maybe from thinking about products into something more like, if we were to imagine, maybe we're designing a service, or maybe we're designing a website or something else, but what if we were to think of that service or website as a place, not just a product? So that changes the dynamic from there in the kind of conventional consumer model. Designers design something, somebody buys and then uses it. When you think about your design as a sort of place, then you start to ask questions that go a little beyond just, is this usable, but actually what's the quality of life for the people who have to interact and who depend on my service or my product every day, you know, to have their social life, to do their work, all of those kinds of things. So if we think about inclusive design as kind of coming from a systems perspective, and you know, also recognizing that there are ripple effects, that we may make a small decision that has, you know, a clear motivation inside the context of our product or service, but that may have very big impacts socially, and to start to look at, you know, what could those positive ripple impacts be socially, as well as ones that may be more detrimental.
Do you have anything to add?
Yeah,
Build the responsibility. Is it designer only because it's your background?
Yeah.
Is it the designer only who should design? Or?
I think inclusive design is a shared responsibility for sure, and to actually, you know, go from concept to you know, a pilot to a service or a product that's being launched. There's so many key players in the picture. And as Colin mentioned, a lot of it is about, for me at least, navigating voices, and that includes the voice of the designer. So constantly checking with ourselves, looking inwards, thinking about our own biases, our own belief systems, recognizing that as people we have limitations, but also looking outwards and understanding the needs of people, asking who is in the room, who are we hearing, and maybe what are some of the perspectives that are missing. So it's really about bringing together different perspectives, which can be very challenging sometimes, because sometimes we might find that there's you know, contradictions, or, you know, to meet the needs of one perspective, we might be compromising another, and that's where you know, I think inclusive design, there's almost a skill set of negotiation that takes place. We're constantly trying to understand, you know, how do we meet the needs of different people without compromising the needs of others, or compromising the intent of the project, etc. So we work under, you know, we work within a context, and we're constantly navigating that. And I think it's also important to recognize that as designers, we're constantly making decisions about, you know, who is being included, who is being excluded. Every feature, you know, every color, every you know, choice that we make influences how people access our services. And so it's really important to think about, you know, how do we create options for everyone to find a way to participate, so there isn't, you know, one approach that's going to suit everybody. There are commonalities between us as people, and so it's important to find that common thread, but there's also different nuances. And so creating options and thinking about differentiating, be it through channels, for example, online, offline. When I think about service, I think about calling, you know, versus having access to a digital platform versus in person, for example. People have preferences, and depending on their needs, one might make more sense than the other. Yeah, so just being mindful, I think, of ourselves and of what's going on around us, and bringing people together is a big part of it.
It's interesting because I'm just linking to what was said this morning for those who are here this morning about if we want to have options and answer diverse needs and diverse users, how it should start by our own diversity within the teams. And I think it was mentioned by Sarah Paquette this morning, and also during the first panel discussion this morning, is how we can foster that inclusion within ourselves as teams, and bringing those you know, different point of views, and how we can leverage that and embrace that, so that at the end of the day it's kind of easier to have that diverse product, if you want. So just linking it, lots of discussion this morning around that. Yeah. Anything to add, Denise, about the
No.
from GBA Plus, or?
Well, I'm hearing some very interesting parallels, absolutely. So I love the focus on the various perspectives.
Yes.
For sure, in an inclusive, with inclusive design, it's about, it's absolutely about more than the product, as you were saying. It's the process.
Yeah.
And, I suppose at some point we'll be able to talk about a little more about the GBA Plus process and methodology. Ça devient un outil pratique, une méthode de travail qui est très aidant à tous les niveaux, que ce soit dans la planification du projet. Et ça nous aide à poser les questions, à réfléchir. Et puis éventuellement, ça devient vraiment inné, mais c'est utile comme processus dans la planification du travail parce que ça nous force de façon très délibérée là, de se poser les questions.
Tout à fait. Merci pour Anne-Marie.
Yeah, no, I think everyone's really covered it. One thing I would just add is I think what's been helpful to me as well when thinking about inclusive experiences, as you mentioned with the process, Colin, but also just I do a lot of product design. So a lot of times it does fall under the product. And of course, we're thinking about the user experience and how do they kind of, what's that entire experience like? Where are those moments where, maybe what we might call a normal person, I would say quote unquote normal, because I don't think we should even define that. Everyone is so different and unique in their own way, but we could easily think and assume that they can go through a certain flow or kind of complete a certain task or even through a service. But it's really taking that moment I like to kind of think about it in 4 ways. What's the vision experience for them? What are they seeing around them? Are they able to, and what's the hearing experience? Are there certain things that they need to hear or that needs to be audible? Or if they can't hear, what's the alternative? What's also the thinking experience? So what are they thinking as they go through that process? And finally, the reach and dexterity experience as well, because a lot of times in digital products, or even just when you're completing a lot of services, you might need to use a computer, or you might need to use a phone, or you might need to interact with a kiosk or read something on a screen, per se, at an airport or wherever that might be. So it's really understanding, at least it's helped me, is understanding those different pillars or aspects to really think about that experience. Or even to someone where English isn't their first language, which a country like Canada, we're very inclusive and we're very diverse, what's the words that we're using and how are we communicating? And I think that's just been a really helpful way for me to, when I think about inclusivity, and I think about it, especially in the design world and the process, while I'm looking at that user experience and thinking about all those touch points and the way they're interacting with a product or service or job to be done, really, how can I look at it from multiple lenses? Because I think, Colin, you did mention, we're going to miss things. We're going to assume we're being inclusive and we thought about everything, but it's so natural to miss things. So you have to bring those perspectives there. And if for some reason you're limited in that sense, how can you start kind of creating a list for yourself and then finding ways to talk to people and to see what their experiences are as well?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on the user experience. And so when we hear people talking about inclusive design, generally we link it kind of systematically to disability or accessibility. I think there is a systematic kind of thinking, which is true. I mean, it's important, but how can we, if we want to move on to the next level about inclusive design and integration, how can we show and showcase that is important for everyone, that it's a benefit for everyone? How, would you have in your experience, in the project you're working on, any example that could showcase that? And explaining the why it is important for everyone, impact everyone, relevant to everyone?
For me, I think it's not a question of moving beyond disability or beyond any other kind of need or difference, but rather to recognize that that disability is really like it's something that kind of is rooted in a mismatch. If we leave the medical model of disability, which says there's something wrong with you as an individual that needs to be somehow fixed or rehabilitated, or that needs that's not normal, as you were referring to, Anne-Marie, and that needs a different kind of attention, but rather to recognize that disability is something that's really very contextual, very social, and very environmental. So when we can't hear at the back of the room, if the audio system isn't working great, and it sounds like it's working amazing, but then in that case, we'd have a hearing disability, right? And that would be environmental. It would be something that was an artifact of the room and the technology that was being used to mediate our discussion today. And so really in this kind of mismatch model, we all experience disability in different times and places. We're not static people. And this is, one of my concerns with many of the conventional industry-based design techniques that do things like make personas, fictional people based on user research, but they're always a static picture of what a person might be, but we're always changing throughout our life. We have injury, we have technology difficulties, all kinds of things. And then the other side of that is also to look at the kind of intersectionality of inclusion, so that the kind of categories don't always fit, and that in many cases needs can be common across different people, different communities, and to kind of go from there. So I think you're right that inclusive design is really about how to design for all kinds of people who are currently on the margins of design today, but not necessarily so much moving beyond as including more, a kind of gradual evolution of our perspectives.
Yeah, and to add to that, I was going to say Microsoft actually does a really good job, I think, talking about inclusive design as well. And talking about like personas, I can totally see that, where sometimes we just assume this is the persona and we're going to run with this person for the entire design. And, they're always going to remain that age and in the demographic and with those needs. So you're right, it's really evolving and changing. And what I loved about Microsoft in terms of their persona spectrum, it's a way they just identified the way we kind of talk about needs that people have, and there could be permanent disabilities, which is if someone is blind or deaf or hard of hearing, those would kind of be classified as that. And they talk about temporary limitations, where maybe you just injured your arm, or you have cataract, or you had an ear infection and you can't hear, or you have laryngitis and you can't talk. Again, we're sticking to it's so range. There's so many more variations. Or if it's something that's more situational, like maybe you're a new parent, or you're a distracted driver, or you have a heavy accent, it's hard for you to communicate, or maybe to talk to a voice device because they're not able, the natural language processing isn't able to pick up what you're saying, or whether you're pregnant and suddenly, the seatbelt doesn't go fully around you. So there's so many different ways they kind of talk about it. And I think we, as a whole practice, and just people that are leading and paving the way in technology and design, really need to start making it more than just like the word disability that really alienates a lot of people, and kind of putting kind of that word to it, but instead just understanding how, like, over our lifetime, tomorrow I could hurt my arm, like, God forbid, or, maybe at a certain point, like, other things could happen. And a designer once mentioned this, and it really resonated with me. They said, when you're designing, don't just design, obviously not for you, because we're never designing for ourselves, because that would be self-centered design, but also thinking about like future implications of you. Like, if you were in a temporary limitation or situational limitation, and it really gets us to start thinking outside of, the people around us. And I think someone just said that at that point of like, it really comes down to the level of like, who do we hire? Are we representing diversity and inclusion even there? So the people in the rooms are diverse. It's not just the same set of people with the same maybe cognitive or visual abilities as well. So I just really love how they kind of break that down. It really starts making you think a little bit more of how do we look at people around us, and how do we, as designers as well, or anyone that's kind of designing for inclusivity, to think about the different implications around that.
Yeah, true. Thank you. So if I play comme on dit en français, si je dois jouer le rôle de l'avocat du diable, So in the context of the digital forum today, some people would say, well, adopting an inclusive mindset, it may prevent us from being innovative. It may, slow down the process. We hear that type of argument. It may, cost more money. Require more resources. So how can we showcase, using concrete example, other from your own experience or other success story from other organizations, to actually demonstrate that adopting inclusive mindset, it's a mindset, it's a way of working, and it does not cost more money, it does not, require more resources. It's just a way of working for the most impact at the end. So how how would you respond to that type of argument or that type of thinking, if I can say?
So in the context of the work that my team is doing on gender inclusion, we talk a lot about how, why this is important and how we're really downstream from, what's happening right now in Canada. So, we see now provinces introducing a third gender. A lot of departments now are starting to as well follow in those practices. And so when we don't work together to adopt an inclusive mindset, we risk not being able to deliver a consistent service to clients. So we've seen situations where people have been denied service because of it. Some departments have faced litigations when it comes to human rights violations. And I think as well, thinking about, I think there's this kind of balance between taking the time to understand context and be able to consider all the different voices so that we can develop a service that can meet people's needs well. Otherwise, sometimes when we jump, right into something without going through an inclusive process, we put ourselves in situations where we spend the majority of our time, our energy, our money managing disappointment.
Yeah.
So an example of this in government is ATIPs, so access to information requests. Mm-hmm. When people give us their information and they want to know what the government knows about them, they file an ATIP. So this is a huge operational cost, but it's also, it's people telling us, I don't trust what you're doing with my data. And so I think little examples like that show us that if we don't take an inclusive approach, we risk putting ourselves in a position where we're just being reactive and we're spending our time and our energy managing disappointment, which isn't great.
Lots of energy for nothing, right?
Yeah, my team at IRCC also managed the call center. And so it's kind of like a vacuum for all newcomer frustrations. And part of our work was to go and shadow call center agents. And it was a really interesting experience because for me, watching them answer these calls, I felt like they were almost playing the role of social workers because, they're having to, support people who are really, really upset on the phone. And yeah, so I think that when we don't serve people well, we channel a lot of frustrations to the service side, which
it's an impact on the product.
Yeah, which is speaking to that ripple effect of thinking about taking a systems lens and how do all these pieces fit together.
And so some of those costs are seen as kind of externalities to the service or the product, and yet they cost huge amounts of money. I guess another point that you made is that a human rights complaint is a lot more expensive than not having one, and has a big impact.
This is absolutely fascinating to see where this is going, but if I may, I just want to stop down on this idea of inclusive mindset. And it kind of just got me thinking. I mean, it's not only about having an open mind, right? Like, we all like to think we're pretty open-minded, but it's really, like you say, it's a way of being, and it's also something that we need to be quite deliberate about.
Yes.
I enjoyed hearing the intersectional and the systems analysis, and if we're, I'm sure all of us here would want to include and want to be inclusive, but it's more than wanting to, right? Ça prend plus que la bonne volonté. Il s'agit vraiment de comprendre les enjeux, savoir quelles questions poser et savoir aussi qu'on est tous biaisés. Et on ne veut pas l'admettre toujours, mais on est tous. Écoute, un processus dans le cerveau qui nous a permis de rapidement assimiler de l'information. Ça a énormément d'avantages. Le fait que on a déjà une impression d'une personne dans moins qu'une seconde au niveau de son sexe, au niveau de sa race. C'est des mécanismes humains, mais on doit être deliberate. So this inclusive mindset is about not pushing that away. It's about recognizing those issues, and it's about how, knowing that we all have these biases, how do we then recognize them and, most importantly, overcome them, right? So if you are tooled up, I think, with the skills, the competencies, the tools, the work methods, and again, I'll plug my GBA+. If you've got that at your disposal, I think looking at whether it be individual characteristics that may cause barriers to the product, the service, or whether you look at it from the systems level and what issue, what service are you trying to provide? Who's affected by that issue? Who risks being excluded? How do I adapt to that? So these are really deliberate questions. It's not just la bonne volonté. C'est vraiment de se mettre des méthodes de travail en place. Effectivement, des équipes qui ont une représentation de différentes perspectives, c'est extraordinaire, mais aussi des outils de travail et puis une façon méthodique d'appliquer ces genres de questions.
Merci, Denise. Ouais, c'est très intéressant ton point sur les préjugés inconscients. C'est quelque chose que, when we work on diversity and inclusion, or even working on, adopting an inclusive mindset, either in a policy side or on any product or project you're working on. So the first really step is really to recognize our own biases. It starts by a self-reflection on ourselves, and because we all do have biases, exactly what you were mentioning, like some filters that our brain is using to kind of digest all the information that we are digesting everywhere and coming from everywhere every day. So really starting by self-reflecting on our own privileges and challenging assumption. I think this morning we heard that a lot. Questionner le pourquoi on fait ça comme ça. Pourquoi on fait ça? Est-ce qu'on exclut des communautés ou des groupes en faisant un design comme ça? It's keeping the why question. That's one of the strategies we use to actually, think beyond the present and beyond what exists. So que tu m'as dressé la table pour les préjugés, fait que je pouvais pas juste laisser passer. Like, Anne-Marie, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, no, this is great. I think I love how you said, like, you got to really understand your own biases, because if that's prevalent, if that's there, that's really going to interfere with whatever you're seeing and hearing around you. It's easy for me to say, like, a blind person is going to experience the product like this, or I could just come to these conclusions, but that doesn't mean it's correct at all. And what we've realized too, when a lot of the students are working on different projects, some of them are with newcomers to Canada. They actually worked on a project with BMO for their whole banking platform. It's like, how do we create a great experience and really understand what are the pain points and things that newcomers to Canada are experiencing. It wasn't enough for them just to talk about it themselves, right? And just come up with what they think people in Canada are experiencing. They actually have to go and talk to people and understand, what they were saying. I think the same thing, we had a student that was creating a product for people with visual impairment. And during user testing, it was very important that a lot of times students will just pass the phone off to somebody that can see and tell them, like, very well and get them to test. But it was really important that student knew that they had to go and get, someone that had that similar visual issue to test with it. So I think it's really important to, as a whole, like, a lot of times it's going to be hard, especially at I think a government like Mass Canadian level, but if we can, how do we get to know the groups and the people we're designing for? I think that's where we can start coming out of our shell. We could start, putting our biases in the closet and really opening our eyes to seeing what's around us. And I remember I talked to someone at the Canadian Digital Service recently, and she said they were working on a product with one of the departments, I forget which one now, but they actually went to a place, I think it was the Center for the Blind, And then it was only what she said when she walked in there and she started talking to people and got them, I think, to test whatever they were working on. It really opened up her eyes to see like what was the true experience of that person using that product or that service. So I think it's really important, if possible. Sure, we can't spend time with everyone in the world, obviously, but can we broaden the groups we test with, the people we're talking to, the surveys we're sending out, even, again, at a process level, as a hiring level, the people that we work with, even the people that advise us on these products. I think it's really important for people in leadership, in management, even stakeholders at companies to be aware of that we're not always very business metric driven only, even though there are really great cases to show how that by having inclusion and diversity really helps us from a business case standpoint. But if we can just really build those circles, social circles, and kind of create little pods or ways we can help our teams and people that are building services and products to have those windows into the people from all different backgrounds and experiences as well.
Yeah, I like what you said, the building the social networks and circles. That's a great one. Yeah. And do you want to play Kahoot another time? Are we ready for another question? Est-on prêt? Ouais? Good? OK. Alors, on va jouer un peu? So, Scott, qui est Scott? Scott a été le plus rapide, alors. So, second question, at which stage do we need to consider designing inclusively? Is it at the planning stage, the evaluation, the implementation, or all of the above? À quelle étape doit-on considérer de faire du design de manière inclusive? Est-ce que c'est au niveau de la planification, l'évaluation, de la mise en œuvre, ou alors de toutes ces réponses? Merci, je vais vous laisser répondre. And we can maybe talk about the how. The crown of the colleague, a public servant here, I probably want to know, like, if we want to do it, like if we're convinced that this is how we should do it, and we know it's important and it's more relevant in the work that we do, but is there any strategy, tools, advice? Training is part of it, but from your own experience and your background, how can people, now that we believe and know how it should work, how can we do that in our everyday job? How should we consider doing that?
I'm so happy you asked that question.
Yeah!
Let's go with GBA Plus. So I guess the first thing I'll say is that if you've got, I think most of you here, if not all of you, are public servants, GCpedia has a nice collection of GBA Plus related tools. We also have the online course. I'll make a little plug there on the Women and Gender Equality website. Highly encourage you to go there. But one tool in particular that I will draw your attention to is around, it's not specifically around inclusive design per se, but it is around like design thinking and those concepts, and you'll see that the parallels are very clear. So the how, I mean, it's all well and good to say, okay, what questions and the why, but to really be tooled up to do this, we need to have the skills, we need to have the training, but we also need to know how this applies to our context, and which is why I'm so delighted to have this chat, because we've gotten quite good at applying these methodologies to a policy world, but to other contexts, it's been, it's early days, right? So when we talk about design, it's a very good opportunity, I think, to think about how is it that in your context this applies. So if you're looking at the identification of the issue you're trying to fix, donc on essaie de régler quoi au juste avec ce que vous créez, puis c'est un problème pour qui, comment vous le savez, est-ce que vous leur avez posé la question, est-ce que ils ont eu l'occasion de vous donner leur information. It's also evidence, whether it comes from a person's, lived experience or whether it comes from data and statistics. it is equally important to ask people who are your users, is this service, is this something that will address your needs? And then straight all the way through, if you're looking at the planning phase. So we talked about comment on fait. Écoute, on a des perspectives variées à la table, dans l'équipe. On peut se munir aussi de conseils aviseurs. On peut aller jaser avec les gens sur le terrain, whether it be intermediaries that work with persons facing whatever barriers, or whether it be with those people themselves. So GPA Plus allows you in a very deliberate way with a methodology and tools to walk through each stage and to gives you tips and tricks along the way as to how to be inclusive and how to ensure that folks aren't being left behind. Une dernière chose, j'ai pas répondu à votre question, Kenza, quand vous avez dit est-ce que ça coûte plus cher? Oui. Donc, effectivement, ça prend du temps. Ça prend, tu sais, avant qu'on a vraiment le réflexe d'inclusion de GPA Plus, c'est vrai que ça prend plus de temps, mais je dirais que ça coûte pas plus cher et au contraire, parce que ce qui nous coûte cher vraiment dans la société, c'est le niveau de polarisation, right? So what's really costing is that not everybody is participating or contributing to the full extent of their capacities because of barriers. That's what's costly. So what we're looking at is how can we not only make sure that this service is inclusive, but hey, how can this product service, how could this actually have an impact on inclusion writ large? How can we target a group that's perhaps been excluded or marginalized with whatever it is that you're producing? Now you're helping a group or groups fully or more fully participate, which is actually not costly at all, quite au contraire. Donc voilà, merci.
Ça prend du temps au début, but once we've done that in a systematic and natural way, then you get the result because it's more impact on the users. So c'est juste l'approche d'inclure ça dans une approche systématique et naturelle.
Et effectivement, la CS+, pour ça donne des outils de travail, une méthode de travail qui est très utile.
Parfait.
I think it's interesting that you... Oh, go ahead. Sorry. No, I think
go
it's
ahead.
interesting.
Yeah, go ahead, Marie.
Okay. I was saying, I think it's interesting that you touched on data because I do agree, like it's from the start of the process to the end of the process, but data is really interesting too because data really plays a crucial role in design. And a lot of companies, for products, for services, for processes, for policies, rely on data. But I think one thing to keep in mind, and this is for everyone as well, like when making decisions based on data, we need to remember that the data is only as good as those collecting it and asking the questions. Yes. So it's really important at the question, like that before you even start, like making sure we have those diverse teams with, and that comes from inclusive hiring practices being imperative, but also making sure that the questions we're asking, that we're asking the right questions, because if we're omitting certain questions, if we're not realizing that certain things should be something we're looking for at the onset, it's easy for the data to come back and say that that's not an issue or that does not need to be included in the design. But it really goes back to because we forgot to ask that question. So it really comes down to numbers being as neutral as the people using them. And I think because data is such a big piece of it, and it's easy even for myself to just sit at my computer and just get in all the data and make decisions based off of that. So how do I go back one step and say what questions were asked? And then even further, like who did we talk to? Even that can be a really big role. And coming from, obviously I was talking about more like product design, but even within education, one thing we try and do within the education space when we're teaching is try and understand all the different learning styles that we have within our team and really try and understand that it's not just about like learning styles, like do we do a lecture, do we do a video, do a hands-on exercise, a workshop, whatever it might be, but we also try and send out little surveys to our students early on to ask them like, how do you want to be pushed if you're struggling? Do you want like you can do it, a very encouraging, like a way of us approaching you, or do you want to figuratively like a slap on the hand to get you feeling that pressure and to move forward? So it's really understanding that I think no matter what you're doing, whether it's like products, services, policies, or even education, or even it's like your team, the people around you, how do you really try and look at each person as an individual with different needs, and even past the curriculum, really try and understand how can we really help each person get to their goals. And we really try and do that and have like little mini experiments. So we're always learning. So we're never thinking that, oh, okay, we know it all. Like we just have to do these 3 modules and they're done. But really trying to go that extra mile, because we do have students with different learning styles, even learning disabilities sometimes, and they come up to us. Sometimes they'll tell us, sometimes they feel shy. So how do we even create that safe space where people can bring these things up? Same thing in a meeting, people can bring up their opinions and how they feel about certain things, and we don't, as you were just saying, like we don't exclude certain people during that process.
Definitely, yeah.
I love this point you made, which I think is that we need to question the data and we need to question the questions that we're asked to produce the data. I think maybe to take that even a step further would be to start to ask who should decide on the metrics and the data that we gathered. And then ask questions also about who owns and who should govern and who should be able to make decisions about how that data is used, how much value or weight in a decision-making process that data is the emphasis that it has. And I saw this a lot when we were working a couple of summers ago with Sidewalk Labs and Waterfront Toronto as they were building the plan for the Quayside neighborhood. This is Sidewalk Labs is a Google startup company that's proposing a new, very digital neighborhood in Toronto with lots of data gathering, sensors, a dynamic, more adaptive kind of neighborhood, which I think from the perspective of inclusion could be amazing. And certainly the company promoted the benefits. But as we talked to marginalized communities and held over a dozen co-design sessions with them, more and more questions came up about, well, what data are you gathering? Is this my data? Is it the city's data, or is it the company's data? And so some of these questions, Google and Sidewalk Labs are very, very data-driven companies. They have this idea that I find quite worrisome, what they call 10x thinking. So for any new thing they do, it has to prove that it's going to be 10 times bigger and better from the criteria of a certain set of metrics. And I think, being able to ask the question, who got to decide that that was the right measurement? Are there limits to measurement? And maybe the way to solve that in a more pragmatic way is to let our users and people who may be excluded from the design otherwise make their own decisions about what gets measured, participate in the process of doing that kind of measurement. I was also talking with the Amazon inclusive research team, and they found that getting a meeting with people with disabilities, with people in the Black community, with people in the Indigenous community was really difficult. And no wonder. These are, communities that have been left out of the process, that are distrustful of large companies. The whole structure of Amazon's headquarters was, private. You couldn't get into the building unless you had a key card. And so no wonder they don't want to talk to you. So what are the ways we can open up through the use of things like digital technology, the design process, and say, here, come in from the beginning, help us decide what gets measured and what doesn't get measured.
Reduce the barriers, actually, to improve the access.
Yes, exactly.
Norhan, would you have something to add?
To talk about the how, I just remembered like an example of inclusive design gone wrong.
Yeah.
So is anybody familiar with the just show of hands, butterfly ballot, 2000 Florida elections in the US? So what happened was they were trying to design a ballot that was more inclusive to people who are elderly and have visual impairments. And so their solution was to make the font bigger, and to make the font bigger, they decided to have 2 columns. So the result was, people were able to read the ballot better, so it fulfilled that objective. But it was really confusing to read to a point where it led to a misvote, because people weren't able to connect the name of the candidate with the box
Oh dear.
to vote. So for me, the moral of this story is that, oftentimes we have really good intentions as designers, as public servants, as policymakers, but it's really important to make sure that we validate those intentions, and that when we do have an idea, it's an idea. It doesn't mean the idea is a solution until we test it with people. And so really making sure that we're integrating inclusive design throughout the process. And I connect this back also to kind of how we develop policies and programs. Like usually it's very linear. You have a policy, becomes procedure is operationalized into program, into service. And I think like creating that feedback loop between is really, really important. And so that's something my team has been working on. So the policy direction was developed over the course of 2 years in consultation with members of the gender diverse communities across Canada. And it starts with asking departments to question, why are they collecting gender data? Because one of the things that we heard is that this is really sensitive information. And for some people, sharing your gender is very easy, but for others, it could make them feel vulnerable, it could make them feel uncomfortable, and it could also bring up, a lot of fears around discrimination and can be triggering. And so really making sure that we're intentional about collection is important, but not prohibiting it. So things like GBA Plus are really important. So if you don't need it for a program, there's really important reasons for why we collect. And then when I started on the team, we were at the point when we were like, okay, so we have this policy. It was informed by all the consultations that we've done with departments as well as communities. Do we stop here and just give it to 60 departments and ask them to come back in a year with a plan? And so we decided to take a step back and really think about, how do we implement policy? How do we implement policy differently? And so we developed a series of tools and engagement sessions to make sure that we're building that bridge between policy implementation and service. So one example is an assessment tool that we built that allows programs to assess where they're at in relation to the policy. We also developed what we call a life journey that organizes high impact and high volume services by major life event. And so the intention there was to go beyond departmental silos and to think about, the common experiences that people engage with department services through. So, while you're at retirement, at birth, at the point when you're applying for a job, etc. And we are running design thinking workshops based on each major life event to introduce the policy and find ways to bridge between it and service. So I think really thinking about how do we embed it across the spectrum of the policy making cycle and how that translates into services is really important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Amazing. So I think we're going to go to question. We still have 10 minutes left for the session. 5? Okay. We have 5 minutes.
That's a lot of questions.
Thank you for the sign. So, je vais aller aux questions. Je vais aller par les plus populaires. Just again, if you want to ask a question, you can do it through the micro here and also using Slido and the hashtag Digital 2019, Digital 2019. Fait que la plus pour le moment, any tips on activity to help overcome biases? That's a good one. So we talked earlier about the first thing, biases exist and it's totally normal. And it's something that it's a human being thing. We do all have them, but while we recognize that we have them, we also have the responsibility to try to manage them because we don't want the bias to become a prejudice and we don't want the prejudice to become a discrimination. And that's the circle, what we call the circle of discrimination. So that's why it's important to try to identify them early in the process so that our decision-making processes and the decision we made are not based on biases. The first thing is really the self-reflection. about our own privileges as human beings. So it's really an individual journey to start with, right? And then it becomes a teamwork, and then you looked at the team, you looked at the diversity within the team, if you're missing pieces, if you're missing profiles. But it all start by, do a reflection on our own biases and how, like it could be if you're a manager working in HR, in the recruitment, we have a tendency to recruit people who look like us. We call it the affinity biases because they are like us, they behave like us, they are similar. But at the end of the day, if we make the link to inclusion, we want people who doesn't look like us and who doesn't think like us. We talked this morning about, issue management and how having different people around the table having different ideas of how we can resolve the problem is much more important than having people around the table who have the same background and the same way of resolving the issue, right? So we want to try different things. So self-reflection, challenging assumption is another one, the why, till you get a rational answer, an evidence-based, decision, and not, well, this is how we've been doing it, and this is how it should work, and this is how we've been working like that the 10 last years, is be able to argument your decision based on, evidence and facts and data rather than opinions. So I don't know if you have other advice on how to overcome biases. Would you have anything to add to the question? Self-reflection, challenging assumption, being open-minded, of course, and, anything else? Can we go to the next question then to give... Okay, la deuxième is we are often working with legacy system, outdated approaches, and driven by resource availability. So design updates are greatly limited. How do we change this?
Excuse me, sorry, that's my question, actually.
Okay, go ahead.
I just wanted to speak to it, but
cool.
So I've been listening, and I find it a very exciting conversation to talk about design and making sure that what we're creating is accessible. But I think the biggest challenge that remains within the civil service is that we don't get the opportunity to do major service refreshes on a very regular basis. A lot of us are using legacy systems that, frankly, some of them were built in the 80s. We're just trying to breathe life into old products. We're just trying to keep the ship afloat to the next opportunity, to the next time it's a priority. And so I think it's really great to talk about inclusive design, but the challenge is that we're kind of already on a train, and the course is already set. And so how do we, when we have the opportunity to even just do the most minor, the most subtle of changes, how do we leverage those opportunities to start to redirect the, instead of thinking we're on the Titanic, maybe we're on that beautiful cross-Canada train ride, and it's not just a tourist experience, but it's actually getting us somewhere, right? I feel like right now, there's also that goes also with this real top-down approach of where, when we do get the opportunity to refresh something, it's a real top-down dictation, like this is how it's going to be, and we've all decided. And so you can be that person at the very end of the line that's got all the great ideas and the skill to make it happen. But if what you're pushing up is then being touched and refreshed and manipulated and subtly shifted, to by the time it gets to the end, it doesn't even remotely look like what you originally envisioned. But people are arguing that it's quote-unquote policy compliant, that they've quote-unquote done all the checklists. I mean, it's kind of like, how do we deal with the things in the middle? Yeah. And then how do we create that full culture shift that's required for this to be an ongoing commitment? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Want to start? I think I really loved your story because I think it's been on my mind a lot, and it reminded me of a situation that I was in a year ago where I was delivering a design thinking workshop, and one of the participants was kind of skeptical or, was resisting the approach, and I couldn't understand why. I thought maybe, she didn't care, she didn't get it. But it reached a point where it was like just bringing the entire team down, and so I took her aside and I was like, what's going on? And she looked at me and she was like, I was you 20 years ago. And I was like, what do you mean? and she was like, I was like really enthusiastic. I believed in change. I had all these great ideas, and I never felt heard. And I think for me, it just completely changed my perspective, because I went from, oh, this person doesn't care about this, to actually this person cares the most. And it was the fear of sharing again and, being like things are, change is possible, that was holding her back. And I think that it's a challenge sometimes, because, change takes time, and I had to kind of be real with her and be like, I don't know if the ideas you're going to put forward are going to happen. They might not, but all I can do is try my best to communicate them, and make sure that they're heard. But as we're building this new ship, someone needs to carry, and band-aid the legacy system old ship that's slowly disintegrating into the ocean. And that's I honestly just take my hat down for people who do that, because it's extremely, extremely challenging work, because that you're driving a ship that isn't working, but you have to drive it, because you have to keep it afloat until that new ship is being built. And I think that we need to have more conversations between the two new teams building the new ships, and teams who are carrying that burden, because I think it needs to happen in parallel, and they need to see they need to see visually that there is something, there is a new ship that's being built, and how do we make sure that we're leveraging lessons learned and we're not reinventing the wheel. So yeah. Exciting.
Yeah. It takes time. Certainly it takes time, but it's all about the culture, right? It's all about the culture. It's all about the collaborative work. It's all about, trying new things, and for sure it takes time. It's not something that we can do from a day to another, but it's all about, taking our own responsibility, each of us working together, and more collaboration for sure. Anything to add from
Well, since there's just a couple minutes left, and this is about disruption.
Yeah.
I saw a really interesting question in there about does it not get chaotic when there's too many perspectives, when there's too much diversity? Je trouvais ça super intéressant parce que effectivement, quand on a trop d'opinions et de façons de faire et de besoins qu'on essaie de combler, effectivement, ça devient rapidement complexe. Those complex challenges. But just a quick anecdote, we're in the process of thinking through the modernization of GBA+. 1 minute, I saw that, okay. Quick story. Okay, so in the context of modernizing GBA+, so that is looking at, it has evolved over time, the methods of doing it, and it gets a refresh, kind of incremental changes as it moves along to continue to respond to the needs, right? And in doing that, we're trying to kind of take a stock take and look at the various inclusion lenses that exist across government, and looking at what are you capturing, and so on and so forth. So in that context, there are not only many, many different opinions and practices and approaches, mais il y a aussi des opinions qui sont très ancrées, très, très ancrées. Donc, pour essayer de remédier à ça, ou et explorer les perspectives, tout en pas se laissant accabrer par toute cette diversité. And a solution was that we are developing options. We are not convincing each other, because you really can't. So we are going to look at, if we were to do it this way, tell me all, it's bad, great, tell me all the considerations. and likewise along the options. So it's really, it's really looking for ways to make dialogue and the sharing of perspectives not being, I'm trying to convince or change, but it makes you aware if you're going with option one, I now know why this, what issues it presents for you, and how I'll need to mitigate for those, right? Donc voilà.
Merci, ça termine sur une très bonne note, les options. Regardez les options, regardez différents angles. Fait que, thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and Marie, thank you as well, all of us for your expertise. I think that to end with inclusion, it's really start with the people for an end results and service for the people. So that's why unconscious biases, inclusion, so keeping the inclusion lens in everything that you do, in any type of work you're doing, that's the whole intention of the topic today. It's really to keep the inclusion lens. So thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. J'aimerais que vous me joigniez pour applaudir les panélistes. Merci beaucoup pour leur temps et leur expertise. Thank you again. And I think it's the end of the session, and there is a break, I think. Tu vas en parler? Fait que merci. Je vous laisse la parole.
Thank you guys for this very excellent conversation. We were kind of in the back room listening back there, and fantastic conversations and loving all the questions. If everyone can just take a couple minutes and answer the reflection questions about the session, we would really, really appreciate it. So just if you've got your phone, you can just snap a picture of the QR code and the questions will pop up. Obviously, when you see me, there's two things happening. We're going for break, and we're going to watch a video. So we're going to watch the video now, and when it's over, take a quick break and be back here for 2:45, please. And try not to fall off the steps.
Public sector, it's about challenging the status quo and trying to see how do we do things differently, and then how do we learn from it. It's really about empowering executives in public sector to create enabling environments where innovation can thrive. So people can take risks, they can learn from it, and they can share their learning so that they can do things differently and tell that story.
When people think of innovation, often what people think of is sort of hard systems, technology, computer apps. But what we tend to forget is that innovation can also involve soft systems or social systems. So that could involve, for example, the rules and regulations that relate to how we run our public service processes. Disruption is not necessarily something that needs to be feared if you understand it, that it's just basically a change in doing things.
If you're in an innovative environment, you should expect to be doing different things day after day. It takes a lot of creativity, so I don't know that I or anyone else has a complete vision for what the future looks like, but for sure we need to try new things, and that means succeeding and it means failing, and it is an exciting time, and what it means to me is that basically the government is a dynamic place where we're trying to learn and grow. Disruption is important. You can't innovate, you can't move forward, you can't learn unless you disrupt the old practices. We don't want disruption for disruption's sake. What we want is positive change, we want positive disruption.
I think the word disruptive is a bit of a misnomer because it indicates that someone's bothering someone. And we may have to realign resources to these new approaches and technologies. If people are very settled in their ways, this is where the word disruption comes, that they need a bit of a shock, something which is completely different, that changes the way they do things.
Innovation often starts with looking at ourselves and how we can use that understanding to transform the systems that we're in. I like to think of innovation as change with a modern twist.